When I received the alert from my bank that $100,000 had vanished from my account in a single transaction to Hawaii. I never imagined the thief would share my last name, my blood, and the memories of 30 years raising him alone after an accident took his mother from us. Before we continue, subscribe to Revenge with Thomas and hit the notification bell because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. My name is Waldo Thompson. I'm 65 years old, and for 35 of those years, I worked as an accountant at a respectable firm in New York. I learned from a young age that numbers never lie, that every penny has an origin and a destination, and that financial discipline is the backbone of a dignified life. After retiring 4 years ago, I continued to apply those principles with the same rigor. I reviewed my bank statements weekly, kept meticulous records of every expense, and guarded my savings with the prudence of someone who knows the true value of hard work. It was a Tuesday afternoon in September 2021 when my phone buzzed with a notification that made my blood run cold. The message from the bank was brief but devastating. Transaction complete. $100,000. Purpose Premium Hawaii Tour Package. Pacific Luxury Travel Agency. My heart immediately started racing. I hadn't authorized that purchase. I hadn't even considered traveling anywhere in recent months, with trembling hands. But a mind trained for crisis. I opened the banking app. The balance that should have shown my life savings from honest work now displayed a laughable figure. $3,000. $100,000 gone. I felt the ground move beneath my feet, but 35 years of professional experience had taught me something crucial. Panic clouds judgment, and clear judgment is the only useful tool in a crisis. I took 3 deep breaths, closed my eyes, and forced my brain to switch from emotional mode to analytical mode. First question: when exactly did the transaction occur? I checked the details. Just 4 hours ago at 11 in the morning. Second question: what information would they need to execute an operation of that size? My account required 2-factor authentication for transfers over $6,000. A password, a verification code sent to my phone, and sometimes an in-person or video call verification. Then the thought I didn't want to face arrived, but one my experience forced me to consider. This wasn't a random hack from some faraway country. Whoever did this had access to very specific, very personal, very intimate information. They knew my full details, my behavior patterns, maybe even my passwords. I got up from the armchair where I had been reading minutes before, completely oblivious to the financial catastrophe brewing, and walked to my small study. There I kept a metal filing cabinet where I stored physical copies of all my important documents, deeds, contracts, insurance policies, and crucially records of everyone I had given personal information to in recent years. As I methodically went through each folder, my mind began to reconstruct a conversation I'd had 7 months earlier in March 2021. My son Devin, my only child, the boy I raised alone since he was 9 after a drunk driver shattered my world and took my wife. Elizabeth had come to visit me one Sunday afternoon. I remember that day perfectly because Devin rarely visited without a specific reason. We sat on the small terrace of my apartment. He drank the coffee I made for him, and then with a smile that seemed affectionate at the time, but which I now reinterpreted in a completely different light, he said, "Dad, Sarah and I are updating our life insurance policies, and we want to list you as a beneficiary in case anything happens to us. Could you give me a copy of your ID, your social security number, and your full bank details?" Me, being the trusting and proud father I was, didn't hesitate for a second. I even felt flattered that my son was thinking of me that way. I photocopied every document he requested, including my bank card, front and back, to verify the account number correctly. As he explained, I handed him everything in a manila envelope, which he carefully placed in his leather briefcase. Now, sitting in front of that filing cabinet with the bank notification still glowing on my phone screen, that scene took on a completely different meaning. The pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made me physically nauseous. But I needed more than suspicion. I needed certainty. I picked up my phone and dialed the bank's customer service number. After navigating the automated maze of options, I finally got to speak to a human operator. I explained the situation with as much calm as I could muster, emphasizing that I had not authorized the transaction and needed immediate information. The operator, after verifying my identity through an exhaustive security protocol, confirmed that the transaction had been processed using all the correct authorization codes. "Mr. Thompson," he said in a professional but slightly bewildered voice, "according to our records, the purchase was authorized using your personal password, the verification code sent to your registered phone number, and a video call confirmation made this morning at 10:45 a.m. Impossible. I replied immediately. I was at the grocery store at that time. I have the time-stamped receipt to prove it. There was a significant pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Thompson, we need you to come to your branch in person as soon as possible. This requires a formal investigation. I'm going to place a preventative block on your account and generate an incident report. Can you come in first thing tomorrow morning?" We scheduled an appointment for 9 a.m. the next day with the branch manager, David Wilson, who had handled my banking for years. After hanging up, I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what I was facing. $100,000 was almost everything I had left after helping Devin with the down payment on his apartment 6 years ago, after financing his wedding 8 years ago, after supporting him financially through his college years and his first unstable jobs. I had been a generous father, perhaps too generous, always prioritizing my son's needs over my own. And now, if my suspicions were correct, that same son had decided my generosity wasn't enough and had taken what I never would have denied him if he had simply asked me for it honestly. But I still couldn't afford the luxury of emotional certainty. I needed evidence. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing every bank record from the last 7 months, looking for patterns, anomalies, any sign I might have missed, and then I found it. 3 small test transactions made 3 weeks ago, each for less than $6, probably to verify that the clone data worked correctly. 2 days after receiving that devastating message, I showed up at the bank branch at 8:50 a.m., carrying a leather folder I had meticulously prepared during those 48 hours of productive insomnia. Inside, I had chronologically organized every bank statement from the last 7 months, screenshots of the suspicious transactions, the grocery store receipt proving my location during the supposed authorization video call, and a 4-page document detailing the entire sequence of events since March when I gave my data to Devin. David Wilson received me in his office with a serious expression. We had known each other for over 16 years. He had processed the mortgage for my apartment, managed the savings account for Devin's college fund, and had been a silent witness to every financial sacrifice I made as a widowed father. When I spread the folder on his desk, he opened it and began to review it with the focus of someone who immediately understands that this goes far beyond a simple banking error. "Waldo," he said finally after examining each page, "this has the hallmarks of advanced identity cloning. Whoever did this not only had your basic data, but access to information you would normally only share with people you absolutely trust. I nodded slowly. David, I need to see the security footage of that authorization video call. I need to know exactly what happened at 10:45 that Tuesday. He hesitated for a moment, clearly debating internally about protocols and regulations, but finally turned his monitor toward me. Officially. I shouldn't show you this before completing the formal investigation, but given the circumstances and our long-standing relationship, I think you deserve to see it. The recording began to play. The quality was decent, enough to distinguish facial features, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears while simultaneously opening a chasm of new questions. On the screen, there was indeed a man in his mid-60s with physical characteristics similar to mine: graying hair, slim build, wire-rimmed glasses. But that man was not me. Pause it there, I asked, feeling the adrenaline course through my system. David froze the image. I studied every detail of the face frozen on the screen. The camera angle is calculated to show only a certain perspective. Look at how he keeps his head slightly tilted, how the glasses reflect light, making it hard to see his eyes clearly, how the connection quality seems strategically degraded. David enlarged the image. You're right. And look at this. The video call lasted exactly 42 seconds, just the minimum time required by our protocol. Whoever did this knew our security procedures perfectly. I felt a complex mix of pain and something I can only describe as a dark admiration for the sophistication of the deception. This required planning, resources, technical knowledge. It wasn't an impulsive act of desperation, but a calculated operation executed with almost professional precision. I need certified copies of everything, I said in a firm voice. The complete recording of that video call, the access logs for my account for the last 7 months, the full transaction history, the authorization protocols used. Everything. David nodded. Taking notes quickly, I'm initiating the formal fraud investigation procedure. According to our protocol, this will take between 70 and 100 business days. During that period, your account will remain blocked except for basic transactions that we specifically authorize. We'll also need you to file a formal police report. And my money? The question came out more emotionally charged than I intended. David, that $100,000 is practically all I have left. I have monthly expenses. My apartment rent is due in 3 weeks for $4,000 a month. He sighed deeply. If the investigation confirms external fraud without negligence on your part, the bank will reimburse the full amount plus compensation for damages. But Waldo, I have to be honest with you. If we discover that you willingly shared your security credentials with someone, even if you were tricked into doing so, the responsibility becomes legally complicated. Those words fell on me like stones. Technically, I had given copies of my documents to Devon. I had trusted him. I had been, in the cold language of banking regulations, negligent with my confidential information. So, I need to prove I was the victim of a deliberate deception. I said more to myself than to David. I need to prove the fraudulent intent. Exactly. And for that, Waldo, you're going to need more than these documents. You're going to need to identify the person responsible and present evidence of premeditation. I left the bank 2 hours later with a manila envelope containing preliminary copies of the requested records and an official fraud investigation case number. I also carried something much heavier: the near absolute certainty that my son was involved, combined with the need to prove it without letting myself be consumed by rage or the desire for immediate revenge. I walked for 40 minutes through the streets of New York. needing the physical movement to process everything I had just confirmed. My training as an accountant had taught me that emotions are the worst enemy of analytical clarity. I needed to separate the wounded father from the methodical investigator. When I got home, I made strong coffee and spread all the material on my dining room table, turning it into a sort of makeshift operations center. I started building a visual timeline using index cards and photographs, connecting each event with different colored strings based on the type of evidence. Blue for bank transactions, red for personal interactions with Devon, green for shared documents. As I worked, I remembered something I had almost forgotten. In April, a month after giving him the documents, Devon had visited me again with a casual excuse about being in the neighborhood. But now, reinterpreting that visit in light of what I knew, I remembered how he had insisted on letting him use my computer for just a moment to check his email because his phone was dead. I shot up and went straight to my small desk where I kept my laptop. I turned it on and started checking the browser history from April. Most of the entries were mine: news, banking queries, email. But then I found something that made my pulse quicken. 3 searches made on April 18th that I had never made. How to clone a bank card with full details, real-time video modification software, luxury travel agencies' Hawai premium packages. I methodically captured each screen, adding these new pieces to the puzzle I was building. Premeditation was no longer a suspicion. It was a documented fact. Devon had used my trust, my home, my own technology to meticulously plan how to rob me. Now I faced decisions no father should ever have to make: confront my son directly and risk him destroying evidence, go to the police immediately and formalize a criminal complaint against my own blood, or continue investigating silently, building a case so solid that the truth would be undeniable when I finally revealed it. I chose the third path because this was no longer just about recovering $100,000. It was about teaching the most important lesson a father can give: that actions have consequences, that betrayed trust has a price, and that true love sometimes means allowing those we love to face the full justice of their decisions. A week after my meeting at the bank, I decided it was time to observe Devon in his natural habitat. Surrounded by his wife Sarah and their social circle, where masks often drop when people feel comfortable and safe. I called my son on a Sunday morning, adopting the warm, carefree tone of a father who still suspected nothing, and suggested we have lunch at a restaurant we used to frequent when he was younger. "I'd love that." "Dad," he replied with an enthusiasm that sounded genuine. "Actually, why don't you come over to our place instead? Sarah is making a pot roast, and it would be perfect to have company. Besides, it's been a while since we've had a calm chat." I accepted the invitation, feeling a pang of bitter irony. He wanted to chat calmly, precisely when I was carrying the weight of knowing his betrayal. But this was exactly the opportunity I needed to see him interact with Sarah, to observe their body language, to listen to the conversations they considered harmless. I arrived at their apartment in the Upper East Side neighborhood around noon, carrying a bottle of wine I knew they'd appreciate, and a mental notebook where I would record every significant detail. Sarah greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, and that perfectly practiced smile that had always seemed more professional than affectionate. She worked in public relations for a cosmetics company, and had always openly expressed her obsession with appearances and social status. The apartment showed clear signs of aspirations that exceeded their actual means. Designer furniture I recognized from expensive magazines, modern art on the walls they had probably bought on credit, and a collection of framed photos of them posing at events that screamed exclusivity. I took a mental note of every symbol of the life they were trying to project. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation flowed through safe territories. The weather, football, trivial work anecdotes from Devon about his job at a digital marketing consultancy. I nodded, smiled, asked the appropriate questions of an interested father, while every fiber of my being remained on high alert, analyzing every gesture, every inflection of voice. Then, as Sarah served the pot roast on artisanal ceramic plates that probably cost more than was reasonable, she casually dropped the comment that would confirm all my suspicions more directly than I had anticipated. Waldo, I don't know if Devon told you, but we finally managed to give my father the gift we always dreamed of giving him. Her voice brimmed with satisfaction as she settled into her chair. Dad has worked his whole life building his textile import company, sacrificing for our family, and he's never allowed himself any real luxuries. So, we decided to send him to Hawaii on a completely premium tour package. He deserves it so much. The silence that followed lasted barely 2 seconds, but for me, it stretched into an eternity. Devon shot a quick glance at Sarah, a split second where his face showed something between irritation and panic before he composed himself. That micro-expression told me everything. She didn't fully know how that gift had been financed, or at least she didn't know all the sordid details. "How generous of you, son," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral, as if I were commenting on the weather. Hawaii is an extraordinarily expensive destination. Those kinds of premium packages usually run into very high figures. Devon took a long sip of wine before answering. "Well, Dad, I've been saving a lot. Plus, I got a significant bonus at work for a project I led last quarter. We decided it was the perfect time to do something meaningful. A lie. Every word was a lie, constructed with the same precision he had used to clone my identity. And what was fascinating from a purely analytical perspective was watching how smoothly the lie came out. So rehearsed, as if he had repeated it multiple times in front of the mirror. "It must have been an exceptional bonus," I commented with a deliberately admiring tone. "How much did that whole package end up costing?" I saw Devon mentally calculating how much information to reveal. How much would sound believable without raising suspicion? Around $60,000 in total. It's worth every penny to see the happiness on Richard's face when we gave him the news. 60,000. Another strategic lie, reducing the real figure of 100,000 to something that sounded impressive, but not absolutely exorbitant. My son wasn't just a thief. He was a meticulous thief who adjusted his story according to the audience. I would have loved to have been able to help with something like that, I said, watching his reaction. After all, sharing experiences with the grandparents of your future children is a beautiful thing. Although lately, I've been more cautious with my finances. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes shining with an interest that confirmed another of my suspicions. She was the emotional architect behind this operation. Even if Devon had been the technical executive, cautious. Why? "Waldo, you have a stable pension and have always been so organized with your money." Her question sounded innocent, but I detected the underlying anxiety. They were worried I had discovered something. "Just the prudence of old age," I replied with a reassuring smile. "At my age, you start thinking more about making sure everything is in order for the future. In fact, I was recently reviewing all my accounts and documents in more detail than usual. The change in the atmosphere was subtle but perceptible." Devon stiffened almost imperceptibly. His fingers drummed nervously against his wine glass. Sarah maintained her smile, but her eyes lost some of their artificial warmth. "Very sensible. Dad," Devon said quickly, clearly wanting to change the subject. We should all review our finances regularly. Speaking of which, have you finally considered moving to a smaller apartment? You could save a lot on rent. There it was, the seemingly innocent suggestion that revealed his true thinking. If I was having financial difficulties due to the disappearance of $100,000, I should solve the problem by cutting my expenses, not by investigating too deeply into where my money had gone. It's a possibility, I conceded, letting them believe I was seriously considering it, although any major move will wait until I finish sorting out some pending matters. We spent the rest of the lunch navigating superficial conversations, but I had gotten exactly what I came for. I now knew with absolute certainty that the money had financed that trip for Richard Hayes, the father-in-law, whose approval Devon apparently valued more than the integrity of his relationship with me. I knew Sarah was an accomplice, at least in the sense of having pushed for that extravagant gift without questioning its origin too much. And I knew they were both nervous, hoping I was the naive, trusting father I had always been. When I said goodbye that afternoon, hugging my son with the same warmth as always, while he surely interpreted my normality as proof that he had gotten away with it, I made a final decision on how to proceed. I would not confront them with uncontrolled fury. I would not give them the opportunity to fabricate excuses or destroy evidence in a panic. Instead, I would build a case so meticulous, so irrefutable, so completely documented that when the full weight of the consequences of their actions finally fell upon them, there would be no room for denial, manipulation, or escape. Because that's what a real father does. He doesn't seek revenge, but a lesson. And the lesson Devon was about to learn would be the most important one of his life. That night, in my apartment, I added new notes to my growing file. The name Richard Hayes now held a prominent place in my investigation. If my son had stolen $100,000 to impress this man, then this man would also have to answer some uncomfortable questions about why he accepted such a disproportionate gift without any question. 16 days after the revealing lunch at Devon's house, I was sitting in the elegant office of Lisa Carter, a lawyer specializing in criminal and civil law, with whom I had shared years of professional collaboration. When I worked as an expert accounting witness in corporate fraud cases, it had been almost 4 years since our last interaction. But when I contacted her, briefly explaining my situation, she immediately cleared space in her schedule. Lisa was 43, with a mind as sharp as a scalpel and a reputation for being absolutely relentless when defending her clients. More importantly, she knew my character and professional ethics well enough to know that if I was in her office with a bulky folder under my arm, the situation was genuinely serious. "Waldo," she said as she closed her office door behind us, "you mentioned family fraud in your message, which is already delicate. But when you added that it involved $100,000 and identity cloning, I knew this was beyond an ordinary dispute." I sat across from her mahogany desk and placed the meticulously prepared folder on it. Over the last few days, I had organized every piece of evidence into color-coded sections: bank documentation, a timeline of events, transcripts of conversations, screenshots of the search history from my computer, photos of the documents I gave to Devon, and a detailed analysis of behavioral patterns. "Lisa, what I'm about to show you represents the deepest betrayal I have experienced in my 65 years of life. And I need your help not just to recover my money, but to ensure that whoever did this fully understands the consequences of their decisions." I spent the next 50 minutes chronologically narrating every event. From that March afternoon when I naively handed over my personal documents, through the discovery of the fraud, to the lunch where I confirmed the destination of the stolen funds. Lisa took notes on her tablet with impressive speed, occasionally interrupting to ask specific questions about dates or technical details. When I finally finished, she remained silent for almost a full minute, reviewing her notes and my documentation. Then she looked up with an expression that mixed professional admiration and personal empathy. "Waldo, this is forensic-level work. You've documented this case with a meticulousness that frankly has saved me 80% of the initial investigative work I would normally require." She paused, carefully choosing her next words. "But before we discuss legal strategies, I need to ask you something fundamental. Are you absolutely sure you want to proceed against your own son? Because once we initiate formal action, there will be no discreet turning back. This will become a public record." The question was valid and expected. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of 49 years of single fatherhood pressing on my shoulders. "Lisa, for 30 years, I've been a father, mother, mentor, and financial support for Devin. I raised him alone after losing Elizabeth. I sacrificed promotions at work to be present at his school events. I worked countless hours of overtime to pay for his private university when public ones were perfectly adequate just because he insisted I supported him financially through every stumble in his 20s. My voice broke slightly, but I continued. And he decided that all of that didn't matter as much as impressing a vain father-in-law with money stolen from my retirement. Lisa nodded slowly. "So, this isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility and consequences." "Exactly. If I simply forgive this in silence, what am I really teaching him? That you can betray trust without repercussions, as long as it's family. That unconditional love means an absence of boundaries. That's not love, Lisa. That's complicity." She opened a new document on her computer and began to structure options. "Very well. From a legal perspective, you have 3 main avenues we can pursue simultaneously or sequentially, as you prefer." She activated her secondary screen so we could both see as she outlined the plan. "First avenue, a criminal complaint for aggravated fraud, document forgery, and identity theft. With the evidence you've gathered, especially the search history on your computer and the prior test transactions, we can prove premeditation. This could result in a prison sentence of 3 to 7 years, depending on the severity determined by the judge." The mention of prison made my stomach clench, but I kept my expression neutral. "Second avenue, a civil lawsuit for the recovery of funds plus damages. This would include not only the principal $100,000, but also legal fees, accrued interest, and compensation for the emotional and financial stress caused. This path is independent of the criminal one and has slightly different standards of proof. Third avenue, and possibly the most strategic for your educational goals, a judicially supervised restorative process. This would involve Devin formally acknowledging his responsibility before a judge, accepting a structured restitution plan, and potentially participating in mandatory therapy as part of the agreement. This option avoids prison, but creates a permanent record of his actions. I processed each option carefully. Can we combine elements of all 3 avenues? Lisa smiled slightly. Absolutely. In fact, I would recommend starting by filing the full criminal complaint. That establishes the legal seriousness of the matter and creates significant pressure. Simultaneously, we prepare the civil suit as a backup. Then, depending on how Devin responds, we can offer the restorative option as an alternative to a full trial, provided he accepts very specific conditions. What kind of conditions? I asked, leaning forward. She began to list them, raising her fingers. A written and notarized acknowledgement of the full facts without minimization. full restitution of the $100,000 through a verifiable payment plan with real collateral, professional psychological therapy for a minimum of 2 years with quarterly reports, a public letter of apology addressed to you and anyone else affected, and crucially, a no-contact clause. He does not initiate contact with you until he demonstrates sustained compliance with all the above conditions for a minimum period of 19 months. Each point resonated with what I had vaguely imagined, but couldn't legally articulate. That sounds exactly like what I need. I don't want to destroy my son. Lisa, I want to transform him. Then we have our base strategy, she confirmed, starting to create a new digital folder. Now, let's talk about realistic timelines. The bank investigation, which is already underway, will take another 50 to 70 days. As you've indicated, we can use that time to meticulously prepare all the legal documentation. Once we have the official report from the bank confirming the fraud, we'll file the criminal complaint and civil suit simultaneously. How long would you estimate until we reach some kind of resolution? In the best-case scenario where Devon quickly accepts responsibility and negotiates the restorative agreement, we could have something definitive in 7 to 9 months. If he decides to fight this and it goes to a full trial, we're talking 13 to 19 months. She paused significantly. Waldo, you also need to prepare financially for this battle. My fees, court costs, additional experts we might need. This could add up to between $9,000 and $13,000, depending on how complicated it gets. That figure hit me. Money I didn't have available since my account was still partially frozen. But then I remembered something important. I have a friend, Thomas Reynolds, with whom I've maintained a close relationship for decades. He's a man of means and solid principles. I believe he might be willing to lend me what's necessary through a formal agreement. Lisa nodded in approval. A properly documented loan from a third party also adds to your case, demonstrating that the fraud caused you real financial hardship that required extraordinary measures. We spent the next hour going over technical details, establishing a work schedule, and discussing potential complications. As I was finally preparing to leave, Lisa came around her desk and placed a hand on my shoulder. Waldo, what you're doing requires immense courage. Many fathers in your position would choose silence out of discomfort or social shame. The fact that you're willing to face this publicly speaks to your integrity or my stubbornness, I replied with a bitter smile. No, it speaks to your genuine love, because truly loving someone means helping them face the consequences of their actions, not protecting them from them. 3 weeks after my meeting with Lisa, the financial reality of my situation began to manifest in increasingly concrete and urgent ways. My landlord, a man named Henry Davis, with whom I had maintained a cordial relationship for the 9 years I'd been a tenant, called to remind me that the monthly payment of $4,000 for October was due in 5 days, and he hadn't received the usual transfer. Waldo, I know you've always been punctual with your payments, he said with an uncomfortable tone, but I need certainty that you can meet it this month. I have my own mortgage that depends on that income. I briefly explained that I was facing a temporary banking issue that would be resolved in the coming weeks, but I heard the skepticism in his silence. I promised to visit him in person before the weekend with documentation to support my situation. After hanging up, I mentally calculated my immediate options. I had about $3,000 accessible in my blocked account for basic expenses, enough for food and utilities, but absolutely insufficient for rent, the upfront legal fees Lisa required, or any additional emergencies. It was time to do something I found deeply difficult. Ask for help. not out of superficial pride, but because for my entire adult life, I had been the one offering support to others, especially Devon. Reversing that role meant admitting a vulnerability that my generation rarely found comfortable, but circumstances didn't allow for emotional indulgence. I called Thomas Reynolds, my friend of 40 years, a college buddy who had pursued an entrepreneurial path while I chose the stability of corporate accounting. Thomas had prospered with a chain of hardware stores on the outskirts of New York. And more important than his financial success, he was a man whose word was worth more than any legal contract. Thomas, I need to talk to you about a sensitive matter. Could we meet tomorrow? His response was immediate and warm. Waldo, your voice sounds serious. Are you okay? We can meet today if it's urgent. We arranged to meet that afternoon at a quiet cafe near the park, far from places where we might run into common acquaintances. When I arrived, Thomas was already waiting at a secluded table with 2 coffees served. He was 67, with completely white hair and the physical robustness of someone who has worked with his hands as well as his mind. I told him everything. I didn't omit a single embarrassing detail, not one painful dimension of how my own son had studied my routines, exploited my trust, and executed a calculated theft that left me on the verge of losing my home. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression gradually transforming from concern to contained indignation. That boy, he said finally with a tense voice. I watched him grow up. I was at his graduation. I congratulated him at his wedding. And now you're telling me he did this to you, probably while smiling to your face. That's why I need your help, Thomas. But not just financially. I need a formal loan of $13,000 to cover my immediate expenses and legal fees while the bank completes its investigation. I'll pay you back with fair interest as soon as I recover my funds. And I need this to be fully documented legally because that record will strengthen my case, proving the real impact of the fraud. Thomas immediately took out his checkbook. Forget the interest. This is between friends. No. Thomas, my voice came out firmer than I intended. I greatly appreciate your generosity. But this must be a formal transaction with all the proper legal components. A notarized contract, a payment schedule, market rate interest. Not just because I need it for the legal case, but because if I'm going to teach my son about financial responsibility, I must model how obligations are handled correctly myself. He studied my face for a long moment, and then nodded with evident respect. I understand. Then we'll do it exactly as you say. My lawyer can prepare the contract tomorrow. The $13,000 will be available immediately after we sign. There's something else I need to ask you, I continued, feeling the weight of every word. When this goes to court, and it will, I'm going to need character witnesses who can speak about my history as a father, as a professional, as a person. People who know both Devon and me, and can provide perspective on our relationship over the years. Thomas extended his hand across the table and squeezed mine firmly. Waldo, I will testify about every sacrifice I saw you make for that boy, about the nights you came to social gatherings exhausted because you had worked a double shift to pay for his private tutors, about how you turned down opportunities to rebuild your personal life because you wanted to dedicate yourself completely to raising him after losing Elizabeth. I will say it all under oath, if necessary. The emotion threatened to break my carefully maintained composure, but I took a deep breath and kept control. Thank you, my friend. You don't know how much this means. 2 days later, I was sitting in a notary's office signing a loan contract for $13,000 with clearly established terms. Full repayment in 13 months with a 4% annual interest rate, guaranteed against any reimbursement I received from the bank. Thomas signed in front of the notary with the same solemnity as if we were closing a $1 million deal. With those funds secured, I could breathe temporarily. I paid Henry the October rent, also giving him a copy of the bank's investigation report and explaining the full situation. He, to my relief, was understanding and agreed to continue the lease on the condition that I keep him informed of the case's progress. I transferred Lisa the retainer required to formally begin preparing the legal documents, and then, with my immediate survival assured, I decided to execute the next phase of my plan, an experiment that would definitively reveal my son's true character beyond any remaining doubt. I called Devin one afternoon in late October, adopting a slightly worried tone, but without excessive drama. "Son, I need to talk to you about something. I've had some unexpected medical expenses lately, preventative tests that the insurance didn't fully cover, and I find myself a bit tight this month. Could you possibly lend me $4,000 for just 70 days? I'd pay you back promptly as soon as I get my next pension payment." The pause that followed was revealing in its duration. I heard breathing on the other end of the line, the sound of someone calculating responses. "Dad, I'd love to help." "Really," he began in a tone that tried to sound genuinely sorry. "But right now, Sarah and I are completely stretched financially. We just paid for some renovations in the apartment, and our credit cards are maxed out. Couldn't you ask the bank for some kind of advance or payment plan?" There he was, my son, who had stolen $100,000 from my savings just 7 weeks ago, now denying me a temporary loan of $4,000 with the excuse of being stretched financially. The hypocrisy was so monumental it was almost impressive in its audacity. "I understand perfectly, son. Don't worry. I'll find another solution," I replied, maintaining a sympathetic voice. "These things happen." I hung up and added a detailed note to my growing file. This conversation, which I had legally recorded using an app that notifies both parties of the recording as required by law, was another piece of evidence about his character and his complete lack of remorse or empathy. 4 days later, something happened that I hadn't even anticipated, but which turned out to be an additional gift for my case. Sarah called me. Her voice was laden with that artificial sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Waldo, Devin mentioned you had some medical expenses. I hope you're okay." A calculated pause. "Listen, I need to ask you a favor. My mom and dad are celebrating their 41st anniversary next month, and we want to completely renovate their living room as a surprise. We need $6,000 for furniture and decoration. Since you're family now, we thought you might want to contribute." Sarah's request hung in the air for several seconds as I processed the absolute audacity of what I had just heard. She was asking me for $6,000 to remodel her parents' living room when her husband had just refused to lend me $4,000, claiming financial difficulties. The cognitive dissonance was so extreme it almost made me laugh if it hadn't revealed something much darker. They truly believed I was so naive, so manipulable, so desperate for their approval that I would continue to hand over money without question. "Sarah," I responded in a measured and deliberately calm tone, "I appreciate you considering me part of the family for these kinds of collaborations. However, as I mentioned to Devin a few days ago, I'm going through a period of temporary financial adjustment. Recent medical expenses have consumed more resources than anticipated, and I must be prudent with my financial commitments until I'm stable again." The change in her tone was instant and brutal, as if a porcelain mask had been removed to reveal the real face beneath. "Seriously, Waldo, medical expenses. You've had a generous pension for years, and I know you've saved money your whole life. It's just a family contribution." My father helped Devin when we first got married by lending him $11,000 interest-free for our furniture. You can't return that gesture now that we can finally give something back to him. So much to unpack in that short paragraph. First, the revelation that Richard had lent Devin money. Money I knew nothing about, and that was probably never returned. Second, the use of the term return the gesture as if I owed some moral debt to a man I barely knew. Third, and most revealing, the implication that my story about financial difficulties was a convenient fabrication. Sarah, I understand your perspective, but my current financial situation does not allow me to commit that amount. I maintained, my voice firm but polite. I'm sure you'll find other ways to celebrate your parents' anniversary without needing to completely remodel their living room. What happened next confirmed every suspicion I had developed about this woman's character during the years she'd been married to my son. Her voice rose in volume, and the superficial courtesy completely vanished. You know what? Waldo, I always knew you were selfish. Devin told me how you hoarded all your money for yourself for years instead of helping him get better established when he was young. How you made him work mediocre jobs while you sat in your comfortable accountant's office. And now, when your family finally needs you, you make up excuses about imaginary medical expenses. Every word was a pearl of gold for my legal case. The recording continued to capture everything as I remained silent, letting her dig herself deeper. You saved money your whole life just for yourself, like a lonely old miser. You know what? We don't need your help. Devin and I have built our life without you. Really. And we'll continue to do so. But don't come around later expecting us to take care of you when you're too old to fend for yourself. The final threat was particularly interesting from a psychological perspective. She was projecting guilt onto me for not financing their lifestyle while simultaneously threatening future abandonment. All with no apparent awareness of the contradiction. Sarah, I said finally when she paused for breath. I'm sorry you feel that way. I hope you and Devin have a wonderful day. Take care. I hung up before she could continue. I immediately saved the recording in 3 different locations: an encrypted cloud, an external hard drive, and a copy sent to Lisa. Then I sat in my armchair and allowed the sadness of it all to wash over me for 5 full minutes. Not sadness for the money or the baseless accusations, but for the absolute clarity that the son I raised and the family I had accepted as an extension of my own saw me solely as a financial resource to be exploited. That night, as I reviewed all the evidence accumulated so far, I understood something fundamental. I had been an unwitting facilitator of this dynamic for years. Every time Devin faced a consequence for a poor decision, I showed up with a financial solution. When he chose an unnecessarily expensive university, I paid. When he wanted an extravagant wedding that exceeded his budget, I contributed generously. When he bought a car beyond his means and couldn't keep up with the payments, I lent him money that was never returned. I had taught him unintentionally, but with perfect consistency, that there would always be a financial safety net regardless of his decisions. I never let him fully face the natural consequences of living beyond his means. And now he had simply escalated that pattern to a criminal level, probably rationalizing that my money was essentially his anyway, just temporarily held by me. This understanding didn't excuse him in the slightest, but it helped me contextualize how we had gotten here. And more importantly, it reinforced my determination that this time would be different. This time, the consequences would be complete, unavoidable, and educational. The next day, I documented the incident with Sarah in a detailed report for Lisa, including a full transcript of the conversation and an analysis of the glaring contradictions in her claims. She responded with a concise message. This is procedural gold. It demonstrates a pattern of manipulative behavior and a disconnect from the reality of her impending legal situation. Meanwhile, the bank investigation was progressing on schedule. David kept me informed weekly. The digital forensics experts had traced the fraudulent transaction to a specific device that, through IP address analysis and usage patterns, corresponded to Devon's residential location. They had recovered metadata from the faked video call showing the use of real-time facial modification software. Exactly the type of program Devon had researched on my computer in April. Waldo, David told me in our last meeting, the case from a technical perspective is absolutely closed. Your son executed this with considerable sophistication, but he left digital fingerprints every step of the way. When we submit the final report in 4 weeks, it will be irrefutable. And the bank's position on reimbursement, I asked, though I already knew the likely answer. Given that the security breach involved vulnerabilities in our verification system that someone with technical knowledge could exploit, the bank will assume full responsibility. You will receive a reimbursement of $100,000 plus an additional $7,000 as compensation for the inconvenience and damages. But Waldo, he paused significantly. This means the bank will also be filing its own independent criminal complaint against the person who executed the fraud. It will no longer be just your personal decision whether to proceed legally. That information altered the landscape. Even if I, in some moment of paternal weakness, considered withdrawing my complaint, the bank would proceed anyway to protect its interests. Devon would face legal consequences regardless of my forgiveness. Strangely, that brought me a certain peace. The decision no longer rested solely on my shoulders. The justice system would move with its own inertia, and my role would simply be to ensure that the process included an educational and restorative component rather than being purely punitive. I spent the next few days in an almost meditative state, mentally preparing for what was to come. I knew that soon Devon would be officially contacted by the bank and the authorities. I knew his world, built on a foundation of lies and stolen money, would begin to crumble. And I knew that, as his father, I would have to watch that collapse without intervening to soften the blow. That would be the hardest part. Maintaining firm boundaries while every paternal instinct screamed to protect him. But protecting him now would be condemning him to never learn, never grow, never become the man of integrity I had tried to raise. Sometimes the deepest love is shown not in the rescue, but in allowing the fall to happen. 2 months after that bank notification detonated this whole nightmare, I received the call I had been both anticipating and dreading. It was David from the bank. His voice was laden with the formality of someone about to communicate critically official information. Waldo, the forensic investigation has concluded. The results are definitive and we have proceeded according to legal protocol. This morning, we formally notified Devon Thompson that he has been identified as directly responsible for the fraud through irrefutable digital evidence. We have also informed the competent authorities. He should expect to be contacted by the Economic Crimes Unit within the next 48 hours. I thanked him for the information in a voice I barely recognized as my own. I hung up and just sat there staring out the window of my small apartment, processing that there was no turning back now. The mechanism of formal justice had been activated, and it was rolling forward with its own momentum. I didn't have to wait long to see Devon's reaction. Just 3 hours later, I heard frantic banging on my door, so violent that for a moment I feared he would break it down. I looked through the peephole and saw my son, his face contorted, sweaty, his eyes wild with something between panic and fury. I opened the door, and before I could say a word, he burst inside, pushing me slightly to the side. His behavior was so different from any previous interaction that for the first time I felt something akin to physical fear in his presence. "What the hell did you do?" "Dad." The words came out like spit, his voice trembling with uncontrolled emotion. "You called the bank. You told them it was me. Do you have any idea what you've unleashed?" I calmly closed the door and turned to face him, keeping a safe distance. For the first time in 2 months, there was no strategic calculation in my mind, only the raw pain of a father confronting the reality of what his son had become. "Devin." My voice came out broken, but firm. "I didn't have to tell them anything. The digital evidence you left led them directly to you. Every search on my computer, every test transaction, every electronic footprint you thought you had erased. The forensic experts reconstructed everything." I watched as his expression went through multiple stages: denial, calculation of possible defenses, and finally something that might have been remorse if it weren't so mixed with self-pity. "I was going to pay you back," he said, his voice losing volume but not its accusatory tone. "It was temporary. I just needed to impress Richard to show him I could do something big for him. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. How he looks at me with contempt every time I mention my salary. How Sarah has to endure constant comparisons to her siblings who married more successful men." Every word was a revelation of his distorted priorities. He wasn't confessing out of genuine guilt, but justifying, rationalizing, blaming external circumstances for a conscious decision to commit fraud. "So, you stole $100,000 from your father to win the approval of a vain father-in-law." My voice rose for the first time, decades of patience finally cracking. "That's your justification. Do you know what that $100,000 represented to me? Devin, you have more saved," he exploded, finally revealing the thought that had likely been fueling his rationalization from the beginning. "I know you have money saved. You worked for 35 years. You live modestly. You never spend on anything. That money was just sitting there in your account with no purpose." The accusation was so absurd, so profoundly misinformed about my real financial situation that it almost made me laugh hysterically. He had no idea that the $100,000 was practically everything I had left after funding his expensive education, his extravagant wedding, the down payment on his apartment, and years of never repaid loans. "Devin, look at me," I said with an intensity that made him pause mid-rant. "That $100,000 was almost my entire retirement savings after everything I invested in your upbringing, your education, your multiple financial bailouts. That was what I had left to live my final years with basic dignity." I saw genuine shock cross his face, as if he truly had never made any calculation about my real financial situation. He had assumed with the blind confidence of a perpetually subsidized child that I had unlimited resources hidden somewhere. "I didn't think," he started, but the words died on his lips. "You didn't think." I completed for him. "You didn't think because you've never had to think about real consequences. Every time you made an irresponsible financial decision, I showed up to rescue you. Every time you lived beyond your means, I filled the gap. I unintentionally trained you to believe that my money was an extension of yours." Tears began to roll down his cheeks, but I couldn't tell if they were from genuine remorse or simply fear of the legal consequences he now faced. "Dad, please." His voice took on a pleading tone I hadn't heard since he was a small child. I can fix this. I'll talk to the bank. I'll explain it was a misunderstanding, that you had given me verbal permission and there was confusion about the amounts. I can pay the money back. Please tell them to drop the charges. I never filed a formal complaint. Devin, I didn't have to. The bank discovered the fraud during its routine security investigation, and they filed an independent complaint to protect their systems. Even if I wanted to stop this now, which I don't, it's no longer in my hands. I watched him process that information, the reality setting in that he had crossed a point of no return. His body literally deflated, shoulders slumping, posture collapsing. Why? He whispered finally. Why didn't you come to me when you found out what happened? Why didn't you give me a chance to explain, to fix it discreetly? That question revealed that he still didn't understand the fundamental magnitude of what he had done. He thought this could be handled like an ordinary financial transaction, like any of the dozens of previous times I had softened the consequences of his poor decisions. Because this isn't about the money, son. It was never about the money. I walked toward him, looking him directly in the eyes with an intensity that made him back away slightly. This is about the conscious decision you made to plan for months how to rob me, to study my routines, to use my trust as a weapon against me, to look me in the eye during that lunch at your house, knowing full well what you had done, while I still treated you with love and respect. I love you, Dad, he said desperately. Maybe, but you don't respect me. And without respect, love is an empty word. The words came out with the weight of 40 years of single fatherhood. For 30 years, I taught you values, honesty, integrity, responsibility, and somewhere along the way, you decided those values applied to others, but not to you, especially not when it came to my money. Devin collapsed onto my sofa, his head in his hands, sobbing openly now, a part of me, the part that had rocked this child when he cried from nightmares, that had bandaged his scraped knees, that had celebrated every small achievement, wanted to comfort him. But the wiser part, the one that understood that true love sometimes requires allowing necessary pain, held firm. What's going to happen now? He asked between sobs. You're going to face a legal process for fraud, document forgery, and identity theft. Depending on the assigned prosecutor and judge, you could face a prison sentence of 3 to 7 years. The bank will recover its money from you through wage garnishment if necessary. And I paused, making sure he was listening completely. I'm going to ensure that this process includes a real educational component, not just punishment. What does that mean? It means I will work with my lawyer to propose a judicially supervised restorative agreement. If you accept very specific conditions, including a full acknowledgement of responsibility, mandatory psychological therapy, and no contact with me until you demonstrate genuine change. We might avoid prison, but Devin, my voice hardened. If you fight this, if you try to minimize it or blame others, I will pursue the maximum possible sentence. He looked up, his eyes red and swollen. You're giving me an ultimatum. I'm giving you a choice between real transformation or total destruction. The choice is entirely yours. 2.5 weeks after that devastating confrontation with Devin, I received a call from an unknown number on a Tuesday afternoon. The voice on the other end was deep, authoritative, accustomed to being obeyed without question. Waldo Thompson, this is Richard Hayes. I believe you and I need to have a serious man-to-man conversation. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. My office. I'll text you the address. He hung up before I could reply. assuming his summons would be automatically obeyed. That night, as I prepared my strategy for the meeting, I researched Richard more deeply. I found that he did indeed run a medium-sized textile import company with offices in an industrial park in the suburbs. His public profile showed affiliations with chambers of commerce, photos at business events, and the characteristic confidence of someone who has built success through a combination of hard work and an inflated ego. I arrived at his office exactly at 3, wearing my best gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase containing a meticulously organized folder. The receptionist led me immediately to a third-floor office where Richard was waiting behind a massive oak desk with shelves full of business trophies and photos with local personalities. He didn't stand up to greet me. He simply pointed to the chair in front of his desk with a gesture that mixed minimal hospitality with a clear establishment of hierarchy. He was 63, with the robust build of someone who enjoys the good life. Dark hair with distinguished gray at the temples and an expression of someone who rarely hears the word no. Mr. Thompson. I'll get straight to the point because my time is valuable. He began without preamble. Devon has informed me of the legal situation you have created. Frankly, I find it excessive for a father to destroy his own son's future over money that he would have eventually inherited anyway. The audacity of that opening almost left me speechless. I took a deep breath, reminding myself I had come prepared for exactly this type of intimidation. Mr. Hayes, I replied in a polite but firm tone. I appreciate you taking time from your schedule for this conversation. However, I believe there is crucial information you are unaware of regarding the full situation. I know everything I need to know. He interrupted with a raised hand. Devon used some of your funds without explicit permission to do something noble. Gifting me a trip I never would have allowed for myself was a gesture of respect and affection. Is it really worth destroying his professional career, his marriage to my daughter, his entire future for that? I calmly opened my briefcase and took out the folder, placing it on his desk. Allow me to show you exactly what Devon did, because I suspect the version he told you omits significant details. Richard eyed the folder with disdain, but enough curiosity to open it. I began to guide him through the documentation, the bank statements showing how $100,000 disappeared in a single transaction, the bank's forensic report detailing the sophisticated identity cloning, the screenshots of the search history on my computer where Devon researched fraud methods, the recording of the faked video call. I watched his expression gradually change as he processed information that clearly contradicted the narrative he had received. The arrogant confidence transformed into discomfort, then into something resembling genuine concern. Devon told me you had given him verbal permission to use the funds, he said finally, his voice losing some of its initial force. He assured me it was a family agreement, where you agreed to finance the trip as a joint gift. And did it seem reasonable to you, I asked, with no accusation in my tone, just analytical curiosity, that a retired accountant living on a modest pension would make a gift of $100,000 without any formal documentation, especially to someone who is not direct family. Richard closed the folder slowly. For the first time since I walked in, he really looked at me not as a subordinate to be managed, but as an equal who deserved respect. You are a successful businessman, Mr. Hayes. You've built a company from the ground up. You manage budgets. You understand cash flow. When your son-in-law offered you a trip valued at $100,000, did no questions arise in your mind about the origin of those funds? I saw defensiveness emerge in his posture. Devon explained he had received an exceptional bonus from his company for a successful international project. $60,000, he said. The rest they would supplement with their and Sarah's joint savings. 60,000. Another figure. Another version of the lie. Calibrated for the specific audience. Devon had built multiple layers of deceit, adjusting amounts and details depending on who he was talking to. Devon works at a mid-sized digital marketing consultancy, I said softly. No company in that sector pays bonuses of $60,000 to mid-level employees, especially not in the current economy. You know that if you really think about it objectively, the silence that followed was heavy. Richard leaned back in his executive chair, studying me with a new perspective. When he spoke again, his tone had changed completely, the arrogance replaced by something more thoughtful. "What do you want from me, Mr. Thompson? Why are you here showing me all this? I didn't come to demand anything. I came because you summoned me," I replied. "But since you ask directly, I believe that as the recipient of the product of this fraud, you have a moral responsibility to acknowledge the truth. Not necessarily a legal responsibility, because Devon apparently deceived you too, but a moral one, a responsibility to do what's right." I had specifically anticipated this question and had an answer prepared. First, acknowledge to Devon and Sarah that you now know the real origin of those funds and that you do not approve of how they were obtained. Second, testify honestly if you are called during the legal process about the circumstances under which you accepted the trip. Third, consider returning to the bank the recoverable portion of the trip's cost. "The agency only refunds 45% if I cancel now," he said automatically, revealing he had already considered that option. "Then 45% is better than zero," I replied. "It's not about the amount, Mr. Hayes. It's about the principle of not benefiting from funds you now know were obtained fraudulently." He drummed his fingers on his desk, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "My daughter will be devastated. This trip was important to her to prove her husband could make grand gestures. Your daughter needs to learn the same lesson as my son, that impressing others with ill-gotten resources is an empty victory that eventually collapses." I maintained direct eye contact. "You have an opportunity to teach her something valuable about integrity. Isn't that more important than a luxury trip?" I saw an internal conflict play out on his face. He was a man accustomed to certain comforts, a certain status, to being pleased by his family. Admitting he had unquestioningly accepted a $100,000 gift required acknowledging that his own ego had clouded his judgment. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "And I need to talk to Sarah and Devon about the contradictions in their stories." "Of course. But Mr. Hayes, one last thing." I leaned forward slightly. "I have built my life on honest work and solid values. I raised my son alone after losing my wife. I sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, and he chose to betray that trust in a calculated and premeditated way. I am not looking to destroy him for revenge. I am looking for him to learn that actions have genuine consequences. That family does not mean immunity from responsibility." Richard nodded slowly. "I also built my business on solid principles. Or at least that's what I like to believe." He paused significantly. "If I had truly known the origin of those funds, I would have refused the trip immediately." "Then prove it now with your present actions," I said, standing up and extending my hand. "It's the only thing I can ask of you." He shook my hand with renewed firmness, something like mutual respect being established between us. "I will call the agency tomorrow to initiate the cancellation, and I will testify honestly if I am called. You have my word." When I left that office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the weight of having forced another father to face uncomfortable truths about his own family. But I also knew that real justice requires everyone involved to assume their part of the responsibility. Not just the direct perpetrators of the fraud, but also those who benefited from it, consciously or unconsciously. 4 months after that bank notification transformed my existence, I finally received the document I had been waiting for. The complete official report from the bank's forensic investigation, certified by a notary and accompanied by a formal declaration of civil and criminal liability against Devin Thompson. The envelope arrived on a Friday morning via certified mail, and I spent the next 3 hours reading every page of the 248 that made up the technical file. The experts had done extraordinary work. They tracked not only the main $100,000 transaction, but also 20 prior access attempts to my account from April to August, including the 3 small test transactions I had initially detected. They had recovered code fragments from the facial modification software used for the fraudulent video call acquired through a dark web marketplace using cryptocurrency that they eventually traced back to an electronic wallet indirectly linked to Devin. The level of sophistication was disturbing. My son hadn't acted impulsively in a moment of desperation. He had planned methodically for 6 full months, researching techniques, acquiring tools, and practicing methods until he perfected the execution. The report included a forensic psychological analysis, suggesting that the perpetrator demonstrated an ability to morally compartmentalize, maintaining normal family interactions while simultaneously executing a complex criminal operation. That afternoon, David called me personally to inform me about the financial resolution. "Waldo, the bank's board of directors has approved a full reimbursement, $100,000 for the stolen funds, plus an additional $7,000 as compensation for failures in our verification system that allowed such a sophisticated fraud to bypass initial controls. The transfer will be processed within 48 business hours." The news should have filled me with relief, but I only felt a strange emptiness. The money was coming back, but something infinitely more valuable had been irreparably lost. The image I had of my son, the trust in my own judgment as a father, the innocence of believing that unconditional family love was sufficient protection against this kind of betrayal. Thank you, David. And the bank will proceed with its independent complaint already formally filed with the Special Prosecutor's Office for Economic Crimes. Devin has been summoned for a preliminary statement in 11 days. Waldo. He paused significantly. This is going to be public. The media specializing in financial crime often cover cases with this level of technical sophistication. Be prepared for possible media exposure. After hanging up, I immediately contacted Lisa to update her. She had already received a copy of the bank report and was drafting the complementary civil suit. "Waldo, we have an absolutely airtight case," she said with evident professional satisfaction. "With this forensic documentation, plus your personal evidence, plus the potential testimony of Richard Hayes, Devin has no viable defense. His only rational option is to accept the restorative agreement we will propose. If he tries to fight this in court, he will be massacred. When do we formally present our settlement proposal?" "We'll wait for his preliminary statement to the prosecutor, depending on how he handles that interrogation. If we see signs of continued denial or attempts to minimize responsibility, we go straight to trial, demanding the maximum sentence. But if he shows any hint of genuine acceptance of guilt, we present the agreement as an alternative." The following days passed in a strange suspense. The money arrived in my account exactly as David promised, and for the first time in 4 months, I could breathe without the constant weight of financial anxiety. I immediately paid back the loan to Thomas with full interest, despite his protests that such haste wasn't necessary. I regularized all my late payments and set aside a significant amount for Lisa's final legal fees. But as my financial situation stabilized, Devon's world began to crumble in ways I hadn't fully anticipated or deliberately orchestrated. The first I knew was through a brief message from Thomas, who had heard through business connections that Devon had been fired from his digital marketing consultancy. Apparently, the company conducted routine background checks for employees being considered for promotions, and the pending criminal complaint appeared in the system. Corporate policy mandated automatic termination for employees under investigation for crimes of fraud or dishonesty. Then I learned, through an awkward conversation with a gossipy neighbor who knew Sarah, that several of the couple's friends had distanced themselves after learning details of the scandal. The relatively small community where Devon and Sarah socialized included several professionals from the financial sector who found bank fraud particularly repugnant. The invitations to social events ceased. The WhatsApp groups went silent. The social circle they had so carefully cultivated evaporated. But the most shocking development came 3 weeks after the delivery of the forensic report. Sarah appeared at my apartment unannounced on a Thursday afternoon. Her appearance was dramatically different from the neat and well-dressed woman she had always been. She wore wrinkled clothes. Her hair was unkempt. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she had the expression of someone who has completely lost control of their life's narrative. "Waldo," she said in a broken voice as soon as I opened the door, "I need you to understand that I didn't know. I didn't know the money came from you like that. Devon told me he got a bonus from work, that it was the perfect opportunity to impress my father. I just wanted Dad to be proud of us for once. I didn't invite her in." Remaining in the doorway, "Sarah, you called me asking for an additional $6,000 to remodel your parents' living room just days after Devon refused to lend me $4,000, claiming financial difficulties. Did you really not see a contradiction there?" She visibly crumbled. I thought they were being cautious with large expenses but could handle smaller contributions. I didn't think. "You didn't think because you didn't want to think," I interrupted. Not cruelly, but with absolute firmness. "You chose to believe the convenient version, because questioning it would have required facing uncomfortable truths about the lifestyle you were trying to project versus your actual resources." "My father canceled the trip," she said, suddenly changing the subject. "He called the agency, returned the 45% they recovered to the bank, and told me he was disappointed that we had participated in something so dishonest. Waldo, my marriage is falling apart. Devon is depressed, jobless, facing possible prison. I'm working, but my salary barely covers our basic needs now that we've lost his income." I listened to all this without expression, processing the information about consequences multiplying beyond what I had specifically foreseen, but which were the natural result of the decisions Devon and she had made. "What do you want from me? Sarah, why are you here? I want to know if there's anything you can do to get the charges dropped. Devon is destroyed. He's considered—" She stopped, breathing raggedly. "He's considered what I asked," feeling the first real pang of alarm. "Nothing. Forget it." She wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket. "I just need you to know that he is deeply sorry, that he is genuinely repentant, that if he could turn back time, he never would have." "Sarah," I interrupted her gently but firmly, "genuine repentance isn't measured by words when the consequences appear. It's measured by consistent actions over time, by a real change in character and behavior. Devon will have the opportunity to demonstrate that kind of transformation. But it will require years, not weeks of suffering." She nodded, defeated, and turned to leave, but then stopped. "For what it's worth," I think you're a better father than we deserve. I wish Devon had learned more from you when he had the chance. After she left, I sat in silence for a long time. The consequences Devon was facing were severe, multiplying in ways that went beyond the formal justice system. He had lost his job, his reputation, his social circle, the respect of his father-in-law, the stability of his marriage, and most importantly, he had lost his self-image as a fundamentally decent person who had simply made a mistake under pressure. Part of me felt paternal pain for that suffering, but the wiser part recognized that this complete collapse of his world, built on lies and stolen money, was exactly what was necessary for true transformation. Partial consequences would have allowed him to rebuild a similar facade. Total consequences forced a complete reconstruction from a foundation of honesty. 6 months after that initial bank message, I found myself sitting in courtroom number 3 of the New York Criminal Court, waiting for the hearing that would determine my son's legal fate. It was March 2025, a cloudy but rainless day, and I was wearing the same gray suit I had worn for my last meeting with Richard Hayes, as if the formality of the attire could provide an emotional armor for what was to come. Lisa was sitting to my left, reviewing final notes on her tablet. Across the room, Devon was flanked by his defense attorney, a middle-aged man named Fernando, who had likely taken the case more out of financial need than conviction in his client's innocence. Sarah sat in the row behind them, visibly nervous, wringing a paper tissue between her fingers. When Devon saw me enter, our eyes met briefly. He had lost a noticeable amount of weight over these months. His face showed lines of stress that weren't there before, and his eyes had the sunken quality of someone who has slept little and worried much. His expression held a mixture of shame, resentment, and something that could be interpreted as a silent plea. Judge Mary Evans entered promptly at 10 a.m. She was about 50, with a reputation for being fair but tough on financial crimes, and a way of looking at you that suggested she'd seen every kind of human justification and was no longer impressed by any of them. Good morning. We are here for the preliminary hearing in the case of the public prosecutor and Central American Bank versus Devon Thompson, accused of aggravated fraud, document forgery, and identity theft. Mr. Thompson, do you understand the charges brought against you? Devon stood up awkwardly. Yes, Your Honor, his voice barely audible. And how do you plead? There was a pause that seemed to stretch for an eternity. This was the crucial moment Lisa and I had discussed exhaustively. If Devon pleaded not guilty and tried to fight the case, we would proceed with a full trial, where the evidence would crush him. If he acknowledged guilt, we would open the door for the restorative agreement we had meticulously prepared. Guilty, Your Honor, he finally said, his voice breaking slightly on the second word. I plead guilty to all charges. I heard Sarah's choked gasp behind him. Judge Evans nodded, making a note. Very well. Given the guilty plea, we will proceed directly to the sentencing phase. Does the prosecutor wish to make a statement? The representative from the public prosecutor's office, a young man with evident ambition, stood up with a prepared folder. Your Honor, this case presents all the elements of sophisticated premeditated fraud. The accused planned for 6 months, used advanced forgery technology, and demonstrated an absolute lack of remorse until faced with inevitable legal consequences. The state requests a sentence of 6 years in prison, full restitution of funds to the bank and the victim, and an 11-year ban on accessing financial services. 6 years. The figure echoed in the courtroom. I saw Devon sway slightly, his lawyer placing a stabilizing hand on his shoulder. Does the defense wish to respond? The judge asked. Fernando stood up. Your Honor, we acknowledge the gravity of my client's actions. However, we note that he has no prior criminal record, that the victim is his own father, with whom a relationship of trust existed, which he unfortunately exploited, and that he has already suffered significant consequences: loss of employment, destruction of his professional reputation, and the breakdown of family relationships. We request leniency and consideration of an alternative sentence with a rehabilitative focus. The judge turned towards where I was sitting. Mr. Waldo Thompson, as the direct victim of this crime, you have the right to make a statement before this court if you so choose. Do you wish to exercise that right? Lisa looked at me with a silent question in her eyes. We had prepared a formal written statement, but we had also discussed the possibility of me speaking directly. I nodded slightly and stood up, feeling the weight of 49 years of fatherhood focus on this single moment. Yes, Your Honor, I would like to speak. She nodded. Proceed. I walked to the witness stand, conscious of everyone in the room watching me, especially Devon. I turned to look directly at him as I spoke, needing him to see my face as he heard my words. Devon, I raised you alone since you were 9 years old. Your mother, Elizabeth, died in a car accident caused by a drunk driver, and from that day until you turned 26 and moved in with Sarah, it was just you and me against the world. I turned down job opportunities that would have required us to move because you wanted to finish high school with your friends. I worked double shifts during your college years to pay your tuition at the private institution you chose. I lent you money you never paid back for the down payment on your apartment, for your wedding, for your car. I saw tears begin to roll down Devon's cheeks, but I continued without pausing. I don't mention this to blame you for receiving help, but to contextualize what came next. When you asked me for personal documents in March 2021 claiming it was for a beneficiary insurance policy, I gave them to you without hesitation because I trusted you completely. That trust built over 30 years was the weapon you chose to use against me. You studied my routines, researched criminal methods on my own computer, practiced the fraud for months, and executed a theft that left me nearly bankrupt. My voice cracked slightly, but I forced myself to continue. The $100,000 you stole represented almost my entire retirement savings after funding your life for decades. When it disappeared, I couldn't pay my rent. I had to ask for a humiliating loan from a lifelong friend. I faced the real possibility of losing my home. And during all that time while I was suffering, you looked at me during family lunches, smiling, knowing exactly what you had done. But Your Honor, I turned to the judge, I am not here to ask for revenge. I am here because I believe my son can learn from this if the consequences are structured appropriately. Prison would punish him, but it wouldn't necessarily transform him. That is why, together with my legal representative, we have prepared a proposal for a judicially supervised restorative agreement. Lisa stood up and handed a formal document to the judge with copies for the prosecutor and the defense attorney. Judge Evans began to read as I explained. I propose that Devon formally accept full responsibility through a notarized declaration with no possibility of future retraction. That he participate in mandatory psychological therapy for a minimum of 2 years, with quarterly evaluations submitted to this court. That he perform 210 hours of community service in organizations that support victims of financial fraud, and that he accept complete no contact with me until he demonstrates through sustained actions over 19 months a genuine transformation of character. The judge looked up from the document. This is an unusually detailed and structured proposal. Mr. Prosecutor. The prosecutor seemed conflicted. Your Honor, we recognize the victim has a significant voice in determining sentencing. However, we are concerned about setting a precedent for reduced sentences for sophisticated fraud. I understand your concern. I responded directly to the prosecutor. But I propose that the 6-year sentence be conditionally suspended. If Devon fails to comply with any term of the restorative agreement, the sentence is executed automatically without a new hearing. That maintains a punitive element as a guarantee while allowing for an opportunity for genuine rehabilitation. Judge Evans studied the document for several more minutes, occasionally making a note in the margin. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Thompson, please approach. Devon stood up, trembling, and walked to the stand. The judge looked at him with an intensity that could melt steel. You have heard your father's proposal. It is extraordinarily generous given what you did to him. Do you accept all the terms without modifications? Your Honor, Devon replied, his voice barely a whisper. Then here is my sentence. 6 years in prison, conditionally suspended. You will comply with exactly every term of the restorative agreement proposed by your father. Failure in any component will result in the immediate execution of the full sentence. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor. And thank you, don't thank me. Thank your father, who showed more love today than you deserve. 3.5 years have passed since that hearing in March 2022. Now sitting on the small terrace of my apartment on a quiet afternoon in October 2025, I reflect on the long road we have traveled. Both Devon and I, though on completely separate paths, my life has simplified in ways I initially feared, but now embrace with unexpected gratitude. After recovering my funds and resolving the legal situation, I made a conscious decision to move to a smaller apartment in a less expensive New York neighborhood, not out of financial necessity, but as a philosophical choice. I discovered I didn't need a large space or a prestigious location to live with dignity. I needed tranquility, basic security, and freedom from unnecessary complications. The apartment where I now live has only 2 rooms, but large windows that fill the spaces with natural light. The monthly rent is $2,600, exactly half of what I paid before, allowing me to save again without constant pressure. I have cultivated simple routines that bring me genuine satisfaction. Morning walks in the nearby park, afternoons at the local library, where I occasionally offer free accounting tutoring to young entrepreneurs, and weekly dinners with Thomas and his wife Carmen, where we share conversations that nourish the soul more than any elaborate feast. The community knows me as the quiet man on the 3rd floor, who always greets cordially, but maintains a respectable privacy. Some elderly neighbors have asked for my help reviewing their finances or interpreting confusing bank documents. Assistance I provide for free because I've learned that purpose comes not from accumulation, but from contribution. As for Devon, I have followed his progress through the quarterly reports his therapist sends to the court, as stipulated in the agreement. I have had no direct contact with him since that hearing 3.5 years ago. That distance was a non-negotiable condition of the restorative agreement, and I have maintained it rigorously despite the 4 letters he has sent me during this period. The therapy reports paint a picture of a genuine but painful transformation. During the first 6 months, Devon apparently struggled with severe depression, even requiring a brief hospitalization when he expressed suicidal thoughts. His therapist, Dr. Emily Johnson, wrote in her first quarter report, "The patient is facing a complete collapse of his previous identity, built on appearances and external validation. He is beginning the difficult process of rebuilding a sense of self based on genuine internal values." Sarah stayed with him during that critical first year, something I honestly didn't anticipate. She also began therapy, both individual and couples, and according to the reports, their marriage survived but was fundamentally transformed. They learned to live on a tight budget in a smaller apartment, without the social circle they had valued so much. Apparently, that forced simplicity revealed if there was any real substance beneath the surface of their relationship. Devon found a new job, not in digital marketing, where his reputation was destroyed, but in a distribution warehouse, managing inventory and logistics. Physical, humble work far below his educational qualifications. But according to his therapist, that forced status downgrade was crucially educational. For the first time in his adult life, he worked alongside people who lived with real economic constraints, who had no family safety nets, who had learned resilience through necessity. The second year brought more visible progress. Devon completed his 210 hours of community service at a financial fraud victims association, where paradoxically, his technical knowledge of how these crimes are executed proved valuable in educating seniors about warning signs. The program coordinator wrote a note attached to the fifth quarter report. Devon demonstrates genuine empathy with the victims. He has shared his own story as a cautionary tale in 3 community workshops, showing considerable vulnerability. The letters Devon has sent me have evolved remarkably in tone and content. The first one was full of desperate apologies and pleas for immediate forgiveness. I did not reply, adhering strictly to the terms of the no-contact period. The second letter, a year in, showed more maturity. He acknowledged he didn't expect a response, but wanted me to know he was attending therapy consistently and beginning to understand the depth of what he had done. I didn't just steal your money, Dad, he wrote. I stole your dignity, your security, and the trust you spent 30 years building. I don't know if I can ever repair that, but I'm trying to become a person capable of trying. The third letter arrived a year ago describing his volunteer work with fraud victims and how hearing their stories had shown him his own crime from a perspective he had never considered. I met a 73-year-old woman who lost her life savings to a scam similar to the one I executed. Seeing her cry as she described how she now depends completely on her children to survive showed me what I could have potentially done to you if you hadn't had the resources to recover. The fourth and most recent letter arrived 3 months ago. It was different from the others. It didn't ask for forgiveness or seek reconciliation. It simply reported on his life that he and Sarah had decided to permanently adopt a simpler lifestyle, that he had been promoted to supervisor at the warehouse for his consistent work ethic, that he was continuing therapy even though it was no longer mandatory, that he had started writing about his experience, thinking it might be published as a warning to others. I'm not writing to you expecting a response, Dad, the letter concluded. I'm writing because my therapist says part of my recovery is maintaining honesty with you about my progress, regardless of whether you ever decide to communicate with me. If you never do, I will understand and respect that. Your most important lesson was teaching me that consequences can be permanent. I am learning to live with that. I have kept that letter with the other 3 in a drawer of my desk. I read them occasionally, looking for signs of authenticity versus calculated manipulation. After 35 years as an accountant specializing in fraud detection, I've developed a fairly reliable instinct for distinguishing genuineness from performance. And honestly, the last 2 letters sound genuine in ways the first 2 did not. But I haven't responded. Not because I seek to punish him forever, but because true transformation isn't measured in years, but in the consistency of actions over time. Devon needs to prove that the changes he has made are permanent, not just a prolonged performance designed to regain access to me, Thomas, who knows the whole story and has been my confidant during these years, asked me a month ago if I would ever consider re-establishing contact with Devon. When I'm ready, I replied honestly. But I won't be ready until I am completely certain that he has learned the fundamental lesson that integrity is not something you demonstrate when it's convenient, but what you maintain, especially when it's difficult. The whole experience has taught me truths about fatherhood I wish I had understood decades ago. Being a good father doesn't mean protecting your children from the consequences of their actions. It means loving them enough to let them face those consequences completely, with emotional support, but without a rescue. It means setting clear boundaries, even when it breaks your heart to maintain them. I have also discovered that there is a rich life after a devastating family betrayal. The popular narrative suggests such betrayals destroy you permanently, that you never fully recover. But I have found the opposite. You can rebuild a more authentic life based on genuine relationships with people like Thomas, who demonstrate real loyalty, on a purpose found in community contribution, on the peace that comes from living by your values, even when it's costly. Sometimes on quiet afternoons like this, I wonder what I would say to Devon if we were to meet tomorrow. I think I would say this: Son, I loved you enough not to rescue you when you would have settled for a temporary rescue. I loved you enough to demand complete transformation instead of premature forgiveness. And if you have truly changed, as your letters and the reports suggest, then the most painful lesson I ever taught you turned out to be my most valuable gift. That true character is forged in the fire of fully faced consequences. Perhaps one day, when the court declares satisfactory fulfillment of all the terms of the agreement, and when I am sure that enough time has passed to validate permanent changes, I will agree to have a coffee with my son. I will listen. I will evaluate. And I will decide if there is a path towards some kind of rebuilt relationship. But for now, I live my life with hard-won tranquility, knowing I did the right thing, even when it was the hardest thing. And that, in the end, is all any parent can truly control: their own actions, their own values, their own unwavering integrity. Even when the world calls for compromise, real justice is not always swift or clean. But when it is genuine, it transforms not only the guilty, but also the one who is wronged, teaching us both who we really are. When all illusions fall away, if you like this story, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box to the left. Thanks for watching. Yeah.